Crowns have always wrapped themselves in the language of purity, pure blood, pure lineage, a pure right to rule. But across different ages and continents, a handful of monarchs pushed that idea into a place we now see as unthinkable, marrying their own daughters. This wasn't tabloid scandal. In several courts, it was policy performed in temples, recorded on stelae, defended by priests, and whispered about by terrified courtiers who knew better than to object. To understand how any father could take that step, you have to see the worldview that made it seem not monstrous but sacred. In pharaonic Egypt, the king wasn't just a man. He was the living Horus, the son of Ra, the axis between gods and people. If divinity was a family inheritance, then keeping the royal blood inside the royal house was framed as a religious duty. The language was pious. The reality was brutal. Marriages to daughters could cement the king's godlike status, neutralize rival noble houses, and ensure that the child of a princess remained a direct extension of the king's own line. Strategy wasn't only Egyptian. It's in Hellenistic courts, descendants of Alexander's world. It's incestuous unions. More commonly, sibling marriages were used to protect dynastic claims from foreign hands. In Iranian Zoroastrian texts, close-kin unions zuidata are discussed within a theological logic of cosmic order. Later storytellers would allege royal examples, blurring doctrine, propaganda, and shock. Among Polynesian Alii and Andean Inca, endogamous unions among the highest-born, often brother-sister, preserved the manna or divine essence that justified rule. Father-daughter specifically was rarer, riskier, and more controversial. But the same cold calculus applied. If legitimacy lives in the blood, and the shortest distance between power and purity is a straight line, no matter how taboo, there was another motive: control. A daughter married outside the dynasty could become a bridge for ambitious in-laws. A daughter married to the king, whether ceremonially elevated as a great royal wife or taken fully into the harem, could be politically contained. Titles, palaces, and jewels disguised a simple, chilling truth: the king was sealing the exits. Even in the ancient world, not everyone accepted this. Priests argued, foreign envoys gossiped. Rival factions weaponized rumors of incest to delegitimize the throne. Later chroniclers amplified or denied such unions to flatter or damn a dynasty. That's why some of the cases you'll hear carry words like attested, inscribed, or alleged. The archive is a battlefield where power tried to edit morality. In this series, we'll move across civilizations and centuries to examine specific rulers, some firmly documented, others fiercely debated, who crossed that final line. You'll see why Egyptian pharaohs like Amenhotep III and Ramesses II elevated daughters as wives. Why Amarnera politics turned rumor into ritual. How Hellenistic and Near Eastern courts bent religion to excuse the inexcusable. And why later empires buried or bragged about such unions depending on what the moment required. Behind the hymns to purity lived a stark political equation. When a king's legitimacy depends on blood alone, the body of a princess becomes state property. And sometimes, the state wore a father's face. In the ancient world, Egypt stood apart. Its kings, known as pharaohs, were considered gods on earth. Their bloodline was not just noble, it was divine. And to protect that divine blood, some pharaohs took actions that shock us even today. Instead of marrying queens from rival kingdoms, they turned to their own families. Sisters, daughters, even mothers. No bond was off limits when it came to preserving purity. One of the most infamous examples comes from Pharaoh Akhenaten, the radical ruler who changed Egypt's religion. He was known for breaking traditions, but in one respect he followed a dark pattern. Historical evidence suggests he may have married his own daughters, not just to secure heirs, but to keep the sacred bloodline from contamination. Tomb inscriptions and damaged carvings hint at unions that were meant to stay hidden. Centuries earlier, Pharaoh Ramses II, one of Egypt's most powerful rulers, was also accused of this practice. He had over 100 children, yet records suggest that some of his daughters were counted not only as princesses, but as wives of the king. This blurred line between family and royalty was tolerated, even celebrated by priests who saw the pharaoh as a living god. To marry his daughter was not seen as a crime against nature, but as a divine act of keeping the royal blood holy. The idea was simple but disturbing. The king was more than a man. If he was a god, then no marriage could ever be improper. By joining with his daughter, he wasn't committing sin, was preserving eternity. Of course, beneath this divine excuse lay something far darker: the silencing of young women who had no choice. But Egypt was not alone in this forbidden path. Other empires far beyond the Nile also witnessed kings who took their daughters as brides. The difference was not in the act, but in the way history chose to remember it. Some rulers were praised as protectors of the divine order. Others were cursed as monsters who defied the laws of man and nature. And that brings us to another throne, far from the pyramids, where a king's love for his daughter brought his empire to ruin. Few civilizations are more infamous for royal incest than ancient Egypt. Pharaohs believed they were divine beings, living gods on earth. To marry an outsider was not just socially unacceptable, it was seen as a threat to their sacred bloodline. That's why marriage between siblings, and in some cases between fathers and daughters, became a normalized tradition within Egypt's ruling dynasties. The Ptolemaic dynasty is one of the most striking examples. Founded by Ptolemy I, a general under Alexander the Great, this Greek family ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. The Ptolemies believed strongly in keeping their bloodline pure, and this led to shocking marriages. Brothers married sisters, and in rare cases, kings were said to have taken their own daughters as wives to preserve divine power. One disturbing example comes from Ptolemy the 12th Elites, the father of the famous Cleopatra. While records are unclear about his exact marital choices, many accounts suggest that royal daughters were often groomed to be wives or consorts to their own fathers or brothers. Cleopatra herself was forced to marry her younger brother Ptolemy, the 13th, when she became queen. Following this long-standing tradition of incestuous unions, but the idea went deeper than family politics. It was about religion. The Egyptians modeled their marriages after the gods Osiris and Isis, who were siblings, but also husband and wife. This gave pharaohs an excuse to continue incestuous practices, framing them as divine rather than taboo. Still, even within Egypt, not everyone saw these marriages as acceptable. Some priests and commoners whispered about curses and misfortunes that followed such unions. And in the case of Cleopatra's family, the dynasty eventually collapsed, leaving behind a legacy of scandal and rumors that still haunt history. What makes Egypt's example so shocking is how institutionalized it became an empire, where marrying your own child was seen as madness, but as royal duty. But Egypt was not the only place where forbidden unions happened. Across the seas, ancient Peru's Incan Empire would adopt similar customs, with their rulers marrying sisters and, in some cases, daughters. These practices stretched far beyond one kingdom. They were part of a global pattern of kings abusing their absolute power. Now we turn to Egypt, a land where gods and kings were often seen as one. Here the line between the sacred and the forbidden blurred in unsettling ways. Pharaohs were not only rulers of men, but also sons of the gods. To keep their bloodlines divine, they often reached for practices that defied normal human morality. Perhaps the most striking example comes from Pharaoh Akhenaten, the so-called heretic king. Known for abandoning Egypt's old gods and creating a new religion centered on Aten, the sun disk. Akhenaten was not just a revolutionary in faith, he was also accused of disturbing family practices. Ancient records and later historians point to the possibility that he married one of his own daughters, possibly Meritaten. While the evidence is debated, the suggestion alone has haunted Egypt's history. Imagine a father once worshipped as a god taking his own child as queen. Was this an act of twisted devotion to his new religion, or simply the most extreme attempt to keep his bloodline sacred? But Akhenaten was not alone. Other Egyptian pharaohs also wove incest into their royal fabric. Pharaoh Ramses II, the great warrior king, is believed to have married at least 2 of his daughters, including Bintunoth. Reliefs on temple walls depict them standing side by side, presented not only as children, but as royal wives. It was a shocking contradiction, the same man who defended Egypt from foreign powers also fathered a dynasty where daughters were wives. To the common people, this was a mystery wrapped in silence. No one dared to question it. After all, who could speak against a man seen as a god on earth? This practice wasn't about desire alone, it was about power. By marrying their daughters, pharaohs kept wealth, authority, and divine legitimacy, within their own hands. Outsiders could not taint the throne, and no foreign blood could challenge their rule. Yet behind the golden masks and towering monuments, these divine unions left scars. Daughters became both victims and symbols, caught between sacred duty and silent suffering. To the outside world, such unions may appear shocking, but within Egypt's royal walls, they were whispered as necessity. Love had little to do with it. The throne, the gods, and the illusion of perfection mattered far more than the happiness or humanity of those involved. But Egypt was not alone in this practice. Across the world, another royal house, glittering with wealth and secrets, would follow a disturbingly similar path. A place where the desire to keep bloodlines pure turned into a cycle of madness and tragedy. And that house was Spain. In some kingdoms, the act of marrying one's own daughter was not whispered about in shame, but openly written into law. The Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt was infamous for this. The rulers, beginning with Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II, normalized brother-sister marriages, but there were also disturbing unions between fathers and daughters. These kings justified such acts by claiming divine blood. By uniting with their own children, they argued that the royal line remained pure, untouched by commoners or rival families. What was truly disturbing was how this was celebrated in public rituals, with priests blessing these unions as if they were holy. The effect rippled through Egyptian society. Ordinary people could never dream of such unions, but they were told to worship rulers who violated the most sacred taboos. It was not only about control of the throne, it was about control of morality itself. When the king acted as both father and husband, his household became a prison where daughters were born into roles they could not escape. For the girls, there was no choice, no future, only obedience wrapped in gold. The palace itself became a stage of silence, where women dressed as queens smiled in public while hiding their private suffering. Similar stories appeared in Mesopotamia. Babylonian and Assyrian rulers sometimes took daughters as concubines, masking it behind rituals of divine marriage. Records from temple archives describe ceremonies where kings pretended to act as gods on earth, demanding that daughters play the role of goddess brides. It was not just incest, it was exploitation dressed as religion. The daughters were trapped, symbols of a throne that placed dynasty over humanity. Their voices are lost in stone tablets, but their shadows remain. Even in Europe, whispers existed. Medieval chronicles accuse some monarchs of keeping their daughters too close, turning them into political pawns or worse. Some of these tales might have been exaggerations spread by enemies, yet the persistence of such rumors showed how believably and feared this practice was. A king was meant to protect his family, yet history remembers moments when power twisted that duty into possession. Across these stories, one truth emerges. When kings took their daughters as brides, it was not about love. It was about control, bloodline obsession, and the arrogance of power. But the more kings tried to hide these acts under rituals and divine excuses, the more history remembered them not as great rulers, but as men who crossed the final boundary of human morality. And yet, this was not the end of the story. In some cases, these marriages sparked outrage so great that they led to uprisings, secret assassinations, and the fall of dynasties themselves. But before that collapse, these daughters were forced to live lives that history has mostly silenced. Would you like me to move into part 6? Backlash and Hidden Resistance, where I show how these forbidden unions sometimes triggered rebellions and secret plots inside the palace? The Habsburg dynasty of Europe is often remembered for its vast empire, but also for its dangerous obsession with bloodline purity. Unlike many ancient kingdoms where sibling marriages were ritualized, the Habsburgs practiced a quieter, calculated form of incest. Cousin marriages, repeated for generation after generation. To them, this was not just a family choice, but a political strategy. By marrying within their bloodline, they avoided giving away power to rival families and ensured the empire stayed firmly under their control. At first it seemed clever. Cousin marriages still technically allowed for alliances, but without diluting Habsburg dominance. Yet the effects of this habit became more and more visible as time went on. Their descendants began to show severe deformities, the most infamous being the so-called Habsburg jaw. This distinctive elongated chin became a tragic family trademark, growing more pronounced with each generation. By the time Charles II of Spain was born in 1661, the dynasty's darkest gamble with bloodlines had fully collapsed into a medical catastrophe. Charles II, known by history as the Bewitched, could barely chew food because his jaw was so misaligned. He suffered seizures, was infertile, and was often described as a child trapped in a man's body. He was the final product of more than 200 years of inbreeding. Historians studying his family tree found that Charles had fewer unique ancestors than the average person born in his own time. In essence, the Habsburgs had folded their bloodline into itself so tightly that genetic diversity was almost erased. The disturbing habit of controlling who could enter their family through marriage meant that personal happiness was almost never considered. Princesses were denied love matches, instead forced to marry their uncles or cousins for the sake of empire. Behind the lavish palaces and golden crowns, the Habsburg family was rotting from within. Their determination to remain pure did not strengthen their empire, it slowly poisoned it. The most haunting part of this legacy is how long it went unnoticed, or rather, how long people chose not to speak against it. Doctors, priests, and advisors all witnessed the decline of the royal children, yet few dared to blame the marriage practices that were clearly destroying them. The king's divine right made him unquestionable, even as his family line crumbled. By the time Charles II died childless in 1700, the once mighty Habsburg line in Spain ended. Centuries of obsession had achieved the opposite of what the dynasty wanted. Instead of eternal strength, their legacy became one of weakness and genetic collapse. Their story stands as one of history's most disturbing warnings about how far rulers would go to maintain power, even if it meant sacrificing their own children to a slow and silent decline. But the Habsburgs were not the only dynasty consumed by such dark habits. Far to the east, another empire used a different kind of forbidden marriage to secure its throne, a practice that shocked even hardened courtiers. As time moved forward, the whispers that had once lived only in palaces or behind guarded gates began to spill into the public domain. Chroniclers, historians, and poets started writing about these kings, not to honor them, but to expose their sins. What had once been hidden in silence was now painted as shameful, grotesque, and unnatural. Stories of kings marrying their daughters became symbols of corruption and madness, used as lessons for future rulers. In Egypt, later dynasties looked back at Akhenaten's union with disgust, seeing it as a betrayal of the natural order. In Rome, Caligula's behavior was written down by historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, not with admiration, but with outrage, portraying him as the very definition of tyranny gone wrong. In England, tales of Edward IV's rumored incestuous leanings became weapons of political propaganda, whispered to weaken the crown and sow rebellion. The power of these revelations was enormous. They stripped kings of their divine image. No longer were they seen as godlike figures above human rules. Instead, they were exposed as frail, flawed, and dangerous men. In some cases, rebellions were fueled by these scandals. In others, dynasties were cursed by the weight of bloodlines tangled in forbidden unions, leading to generations of physical and political weakness. Religion, too, played its part in public condemnation. The Bible clearly warned against incest, calling it an abomination. Priests, monks, and scholars repeated those words, pointing to these kings as examples of what happens when men ignore divine law. The king's actions became proof that unchecked power leads to ruin, that no man, even a king, could bend the natural laws of family and morality without suffering consequences. But the exposure was not only about morality, it was also political. Enemies of these rulers used incest scandals to discredit them, to break their power, and to rally public hatred. A king accused of marrying his daughter was not only a sinner, he was unfit to rule, his bloodline cursed, his throne poisoned. And yet, for all the shame and condemnation, the fascination never disappeared. People were horrified, but they were also captivated. These kings became legends, not for their victories or reforms, but for their disturbing choices that crossed every boundary of human decency. The public exposure turned them into monsters of history, remembered not for greatness, but for forbidden acts that still echo centuries later. But history always carries one final question. Were these kings truly monsters of their time, or products of a system that allowed them unchecked power? That is what we face in the final part. When the dust of centuries settled, these kings and their forbidden marriages were remembered not for glory, but for shame. Their names became warnings written in blood and scandal. In Egypt, Pharaoh Akhenaten's bond with his daughters was erased from monuments, his name cursed and his city abandoned. In Mesopotamia, rulers who blurred family lines were condemned by priests as unnatural kings. In Rome, emperors who broke sacred laws were assassinated by their own guards, their bodies dragged through the streets as symbols of corruption. The pattern was always the same: those who thought they could control love, bloodlines, and destiny found themselves swallowed by their own choices. For subjects and historians alike, the lesson was clear: when kings broke the most sacred rules of family, their kingdoms broke with them, and yet the whispers still echo. Some records are missing. Some rulers destroyed all traces of their actions. Others left only fragmented rumors in letters and chronicles. Did more kings secretly marry daughters or nieces, hiding it under layers of ritual and ceremony? Or were these tales exaggerated by enemies to stain reputations forever? The legacy of these forbidden kings is not only about scandal. It is about power so unchecked that even the deepest taboos could be broken. These stories remind us that behind golden crowns and marble thrones were men who believed they were untouchable, above law, above morality, and even above family. And yet history caught them. Their names may live on, but not in reverence, only in the shadow of forbidden love, where crowns turned into chains and royal blood became the poison that destroyed their legacy. The throne could give them power over nations, but not over the judgment of time.